Okay, we're live.
Hello, everyone.
Do you see that?
Right,
I did that odd automatic thing.
What are you talking about? Oh, yeah, I did see that.
I was like playing around with it this weekend. I was like,
oh, look at you. Good job.
Thanks.
If you are live with us, please say hi. Let us know where you're watching us from. We have a awesome show for you guys tonight. The topic, of course, is a little bit unusual for Hmong people to talk about. So, of course, it's on our list of things, of topics to kind of discuss. So if you are live with us, say hi. Let us know where you're watching us from. We'll get started in a second here. Callie's sharing. And, of course, we have some updates for you guys as well. So before we jump into the show, we'll kind of go through that. Hi, Eric. Thank you. I slept on the way back. Obviously, I was it's like car hair, it's a little sticking up, but thank you so much. We've got some updates for you guys, so I hope that lots of you are tuning in or tagging your friends. We've got updates on the bachelorette stuff or bachelor stuff, finding love. We've got updates on a couple of other things too, so we'll go through that before we start off the show. But if you're live with us, let us know that you're here. Say hi, stay engaged in the conversation. It is going to be, I don't know, I think we're going to learn a lot of stuff today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So, I got you, Eric. I got some tips from Eric about my Wi-Fi and connection, and I hadn't tried it yet. I logged on, and it looks like my Wi-Fi is stable right now, but if it isn't in a little bit, I might have to try Eric's trick to see if it's going to help with my Wi-Fi. So thank you guys so much. For those of you who have watched the show and continue to support us, you guys know I have awful Wi-Fi. I live out in the countryside, and so sometimes you just kind of never know what it's going to turn out to be. So, all right, Callie, are you almost ready? If you are here, please help us share as well. I mean, I feel like today's topic is going to be a very serious one and one that our community does not talk about often, if not at all. I've not really heard much about this topic unless something crazy happens, like murder, suicide. And so this is more of like a conversation that we need to have before all of that happens. And so and I don't feel like there has ever been a space for us to talk about it. And so if you guys are live with us, please help us share this so then this conversation can actually reach your network of people as well. I do feel like this is a really important one. So if you're live, please help share. Please let us know where you're watching. Love to just kind of do shout outs right at the beginning. So hi Jenny. Olivia, what is your lipstick color? Ooh, I don't remember, but I promise after this live, I will go look and then I will comment on there and tag you. That way you will know. It's just like I feel like it's like a cheap drugstore one, but I'll double check and I'll let you know. Let's see here. Okay, I am going to go share this onto my own personal Facebook, and then we will get started here. All right, you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay. All right, you guys. So welcome to All That Talk Show, where we strive to educate, empower, and entertain. I'm your co-host, Olivia.
I'm Callie.
And today we are talking about a topic that, again, I feel like a lot of our Asian communities, and especially our Hmong community, because that's what Callie and I are most familiar with, that we don't talk a lot about, and that is sexual assault. And we have a guest that's going to be helping us break through that conversation and kind of unpack all of that. But before we get there, we do have some updates for you guys. So Kylie and I will kind of go over that really quick, and then we can jump into the conversation. But we've got our Father's Day message. So obviously, you guys have seen what we've done for Mother's Day, and we've gotten a lot of messages just saying thank you and how this has helped people a lot to kind of just I think, like you're still kind of shy. You don't really want to directly say it to people, or sometimes, a lot of them, their parents has passed, or mom has passed. And so it's really just kind of letting it out to the universe. So we are here to kind of help you with that for Father's Day as well. And so if you guys click on the link, I believe we've already posted up the post for Father's Day. So if you click on that link, and it's, again, very short, it's just your name, email, and then whatever message it is that you want to send to your dad or your father figures. Kelly and I will start doing that pretty soon here. That link is open, so you can start that. And then we are also still looking for sponsors for our Finding Love series. You guys know we've been working really hard on putting season 2 together, and Kelly and I have selected who our bachelor will be, but we are not going to announce it yet. We still have some pre-work to do before we do that. And so just know that we have selected a person. I know last week we said we were vetting and kind of talking to people, but this week we're announcing that we have found our bachelor. We just can't make that announcement just quite yet. So be patient with us. I promise within the next few weeks here, we will make that announcement. But regarding the sponsors, in order for us to make this really kind of, top it up from like the first season, we do need money, right? So if you're a business and you are needing some marketing purposes, hit us up. We are here to help you. We are looking for sponsors. And then even if you're like a personal person and want to support the show as well, you can do so by being a sponsor or becoming a subscriber on our Facebook. $4.99 a month goes a long way for Callie and I. Last year, when we were doing Finding Love the first season, that really helped fund, like an Airbnb for the finale. And that helped tremendously for Kelly and I, because a lot of this stuff is coming up from our own pocket. So if you're a sponsor, we have some sponsor packages. If you're interested, please DM us. Or if you know a business and that are looking to be a sponsor, please talk about us, share our information with them, and have them reach out to us.
And we're not looking just for Hmong sponsors. So
yeah, anyone.
Yeah, our reach is definitely beyond the Hmong community. And so if it's anybody that is outside the Hmong community, we are open to businesses and can send our media kits and our insights and numbers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's all I have for updates. Kelly, did I miss anything, or is there anything else you want to
add? No, I don't think so. I think that's everything.
Okay. All right. So I'll pass it over to you, and then we can kind of get started.
Okay. And when we did this post, there were a couple of comments. So I just wanted to read. There were 3 people that commented regarding this episode. And so we had Sophia Mua, who said, "So proud to hear that you will talk about this topic. As a survivor, thank you. It's not an upbeat topic, but the lives you may save, empowerment of being accepted, and learning how to transition from victim to survivor is powerful. Mm-hmm. It took me years to finally say and truly believe I was not at fault." And so we are going to be talking about that too, with the shaming and just a lot of the cultural aspects. So thank you for that comment, Sophia. And then we had Yang Boyd, who said, "Damn, you gals are on fire, taking all the taboo subjects. I'm so proud of you." And we definitely strive to do that, even if it's just conversations in our circles. What we want to do is just to kind of normalize the topics, right? So that you have a basis. You can start thinking about the things that are shared today and just start formulating what it is that, like how you get comfortable with the topic too. And then we had Chua Ma, who said, "This is awesome, can't wait." And so just seeing those comments really pumps us up and gets us excited to really explore a lot of these harder topics. And so today we are joined by Baonam Yang, and he is a training and technical assistance manager at the National Organization of Asians and Pacific Islanders Ending Sexual Violence. In this role, he supports community-based organizations and governmental organizations in enhancing their services for victims of sexual violence from the Asian and Pacific Islander communities in the U.S. and the U.S. Pacific Territories. Additionally, he is an organizer and trainer with ManForward, which is based out of, I believe it is, Minnesota, where he supports the mobilization of a national network of Southeast Asian men and masculine folks to transform patriarchal power systems through direct action organizing, education, and collective healing. He was born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and is the son of Vietnamese refugees. He holds a BA in Criminology and a Master of Public Administration from the University of New Mexico. And with that, I'm going to bring him on.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
Hello. Thank you so much for making time to come on the show with Callie and I.
Of course.
We were really excited when we kind of talked to you a little bit about this during our pre-call, but I feel like this topic is just one that, again, we don't talk often about in our Asian community.
Right.
And so I think during our conversation, it was just really nice to we can probably go about it for hours, but obviously it was just a pre-call. We really wanted to save a lot of our questions and just your knowledge and expertise for when we actually go on live for our audience members. So thank you for being here.
Of course. Happy to be here.
Let's just kind of start off. I think when we talk about sexual assault or abuse, we usually think about, like you've mentioned, like rape and things of that nature. But when we talk about sexual violence, I think there's a lot more to that. So can you just kind of share your thoughts a little bit about what is sexual violence?
Of course. But before I share, I just wanted to say to everyone in the audience, I know that this can be a very heavy topic. It can be a very taboo topic, but I like to talk about it in a way where we can kind of shift the norms, like you all mentioned, of not making it such a taboo topic, making it something that we can collectively unpack as a community and as a culture to figure out what are some of the nuances that allow for it to happen and that perpetuate it or that uphold it, right? Because if we don't talk about it, then we really can't put an end to it, right? So I just wanted to say that. So if you have any questions, any comments, I'm always open to giving this topic spaciousness. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me immediately, and I'm happy to unpack it there. But specifically around what is sexual violence, right? So sexual violence just really refers to any sexual activity where consent is not obtained, right? It's where someone is forced, coerced, or manipulated into any unwanted sexual activity. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, Olivia, oftentimes when people hear sexual violence, they think automatically of just rape or sexual assault, right? It's just the most common thing we hear about, but it can really run the gamut of a lot of different activities, right? So it can include sexual exploitation. It can include unwanted or unsolicited sexual contact, right? Someone sending you a nude. That's something that's very sexually violent if you didn't ask for it, right? Somebody forcing you to watch pornography without your consent, right? If you show up at somebody's house, they start playing pornography for you without you asking. Things like that. It can also include voyeurism, somebody flashing you, that may be something someone's into, someone saying inappropriate sexual things to you. So it can really run the gamut of various different acts that someone can commit.
Awesome. And then, like in our community, we usually don't talk about it. We usually it's like a shameful thing, or it's embarrassing, or it's a woman's fault, right? So just like with part of that, like what makes it so hard for us to talk about it in our communities?
Yeah, I think for us at the National Organization of Asian Pacific Islanders, NAPIESV as well, referred to it for the rest of the night. But some of the things that we've learned is that it's so challenging in our community to talk about sexual violence is because we don't have terminology for it, right? Even for me being Vietnamese, there's not a lot of terminology around what is sexual violence or the acts of sexual violence that I just talked about. So one, that's a challenge for people to speak that, right? The second thing is that in our communities, we don't talk about sex, sexuality, healthy sexual relationships or anything like that. So when it comes to something as, I guess, as you all mentioned, heavy, as taboo, as stigmatized as sexual violence, then nobody really knows how to hold that topic, or nobody really knows how to talk about it, just because of that fact that we don't talk about sex in general, right? We know that our community has sex, right? We have children, we have relationships. There's so many of those things that happen, but nobody talks about sex or sexual violence, or even how to have healthy relationships. So that's what makes it so challenging and so stigmatizing in our communities. And the other important thing to bring up with the fact that it's so hard to talk about is, as you all mentioned, it's a taboo topic. And for us, I think when it's taboo, we have to ask ourselves, like, what function does that serve? Does that serve to benefit the survivor when it's taboo? Or is it really something that benefits perpetrators or people that cause harm because no one's willing to talk about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think you kind of mentioned, like, I think too, like, we don't know how to hold people accountable.
Right.
I think when we talked, you talked about, like, that one uncle. And I think that when you said that, it was kind of like that resonated so much, because I did have a lot of weird uncles growing up where I shared this story with my husband a while ago when I went to Seattle to go babysit, and he's like much older. I was probably like 12, 13. And like he would come and like whisper stuff into my ear, like sexual stuff, right? Like, but it wouldn't be like I'm doing it to you directly, but like it would be like, find a man who can do this kind of thing to you, right? And I never even really thought about like that being what do they call it? It's like priming you, or what's the term?
Grooming
you to like be okay with that kind of action, right? And that didn't really hit me until we had our pre-talk, and I thought back to like, I mean, I knew then that it felt awkward. I knew, like, I'm like, this is kind of weird. Like, why is he doing that? But to like have never told my aunt or anyone, to have never told like my cousin who was there, and she was clearly in the room and can see that it was awkward. But I just think like you just never knew to like tattle or say, hey, like, you know, like he talked to me in this way. I mean, good thing it was kind of like we walked away and we locked ourselves in the room and stuff. And so, you know, he stopped coming over and things like that. But I just think in our community, it's kind of like how, like if I were to say something, how do then we hold that person accountable to like keep our children safe? You know, I mean, I don't know. I just feel like we don't talk about it enough in order to do anything really, because, you know, thinking back to that, it's just kind of like he came over twice. The first time, I think maybe it was, I mean, if this is the kind of old perverted man that he is, I think it's really to kind of come over to see how we react, and then the second time to kind of see how we would react to if he were to, you know, it's like testing us almost, right? Knowing that adults weren't home, but we were there to babysit the younger ones. And so I don't know, it felt kind of awkward. But when you like said that, I'm like, I thought back to that, and I'm just like, I never really thought about it that way, like that creepy uncle, you know?
Right. Yeah. So just give some context to what Olivia's talking about. I had mentioned that in our community, we don't really know how to hold men or even harm doers in our community accountable, in the sense that we all kind of know that there's some kind of creepy uncle in our communities that is allowed to come to the parties, and everyone mentions, hey, stay away from that uncle, but nobody stops that uncle from coming to the parties, right? It's the onus is put on everybody else to stay away from that uncle. So that was something I mentioned to Olivia and Callie early on, and that's what she's talking about. And I think you're exactly right with talking about what he was trying to do in terms of trying to groom you, also test your comfort level as well as your boundaries. If you're willing, if you're going to resist that idea, if you're going to go tell other people and things like that, right? And I think the one other big aspect of that example that you gave is that in our communities, everybody's an auntie and uncle, right? There's no really clear distinction that we tell our young children of like, hey, this one is actually an auntie and uncle, or hey, this one is actually just maybe a Mr. or Mrs. or just an acquaintance, right? Our community has kind of used that term auntie and uncle so loosely that I think for children and young people especially, sometimes that can get confusing in terms of what can I say back to that person? When can I say no to that person? How much autonomy do I have in terms of questioning what they're doing to me, right? Because I think when you think of the term auntie and uncle, that's a familial, right? So, and especially in our communities, we're raised to respect our elders. We're raised to be fearful of them. So when everyone's an auntie and uncle, how do you, Olivia, say no to that uncle or tell on that uncle, or is anyone actually going to believe you, right? So those are some of the challenges and the nuances that we should think about in our communities. Is maybe we need to be more clear cut with our young children that, hey, this one's an auntie, and that one's maybe just an auntie. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of nuances that we can unpack around that as well.
Yeah. So speaking of which, like, we talked a little bit about this too, but I kind of want you to go in on it more now that we're live. But we had talked about some culturally specific factors that enables sexual violence. We talked about like saving face. I think that's kind of like the number one really in our Asian community, right? Like they would rather hush their daughters from speaking than to to save the person's face. And so we talked a little bit about that, but can you just kind of go more into like what are some of those culturally specific factors that enables these people to commit sexual violence in our Asian community?
Yeah, that's a great question. And before I go into answering that, I want to disclaim and kind of put a caveat that when I talk about these things, I never want to say that it's to blame the culture, right? Because I think there's so many beautiful cultural practices we have in our community. What it really comes down to is perpetrators or harm doers taking advantage of our culture, right? So, for example, with Olivia, your example earlier of that uncle coming over when it's just you all at home watching the children, I think we're such communal people and such collective people that's very normal for uncles to come in and out of your house, but things like that, right? But when someone takes advantage of it, that's when it becomes harmful, right? But when I think about the idea of like multi-generational households, and I think about intergenerational households in one roof, those are beautiful things. So I want to just caveat that it's not a blaming of the culture. It's just we have to recognize where culture can be exploited, right? So as you mentioned earlier, one of the things is, the shame that comes around sexual violence. And the biggest thing around that is that we don't talk about sex. So when someone experiences something that is sexual and sexually violent, they're unable to talk about it, or they fear talking about it because there's going to experience a lot of victim blaming where someone's going to say, well, why were you out so late? Were you drinking? Why'd you wear that around that uncle? Or even you knew that uncle was that way and he was drunk. Why'd you just come around him, right? So there's a lot of victim blaming that happens that way. The other factor is, a lot of us are migrants, are immigrants, are refugees in this country, right? So we're already facing a lot of oppression, a lot of racism in our communities too. So there's that added layer of feeling like there's the saving face of our whole community and our whole population in the country, of not wanting to make us look bad as people. So that's another layer of not wanting to disclose that, hey, there is sexual violence that's happening in my house, or maybe someone in my family is causing me harm, because one, it makes you look bad as an individual, then your family, as well as your community, and then overall our API community in general, right? So there's so many layers of shame because we're such collective people. We think about those things that exacerbates it as a cultural nuance that adds in. The other thing I mentioned is with young people, right? We are raised to respect our elders and our men sometimes to a fault, right? So with that, I think a lot of times when, in cases especially of child sexual abuse, they don't understand that that's not something they're supposed to do or something they're supposed to engage in or even supposed to experience, right? Because they're not supposed to talk back. They're supposed to respect their elders, or they may say, hey, if I tell your dad's not going to believe you, I'm your uncle. So things like that we've seen that come into play as well. So definitely the shame, the saving face, and then add in the factors of just, we don't raise our young people with a lot of autonomy to think about what they can and cannot do, or what they should or should not put up with, right? Because even me, as a personal experience, I have a daughter now. She's very young, but I remember growing up, even me as a child, a lot of times it was like, hey, go sit on Auntie and Uncle's lap, or give Auntie and Uncle a kiss on the cheek before we leave. And there was no, are you comfortable with that? Are you, do you feel like doing that? There was none of that, right? And a lot of that is connected to this idea that adults, we think our children are a reflection of us, without separating that fact of like, my child's still polite. My child still greeted you when they came here. They're still bidding you farewell when they leave, but they don't have to kiss you on the cheek. They don't have to hug you. They don't have to sit on your lap, right? So it's important for us to raise our children in thinking there's certain things that are polite, but there's also certain things that you have the autonomy and the choice to do. And those are just a few of the factors that I'll share today.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you make a really good point about, having your kids like kiss or hug. I'm guilty of that. Because sometimes, when we do visit, it's always like, okay, go give grandma hugs, or go give auntie and uncle hugs, or, whatever it may be, instead of like having it be, do you just want to say goodbye and then that's it? Or do you want to go and give them hugs and stuff? You know what I mean? So I think that's a really good call out for us young parents to really consider, teaching our kids.
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
I want to bring this comment over. So Wang Hung Solo said, some aunties are as bad as uncles. Anything the same? Yes. So we are not saying, like, this is not just to attack the men. I think if there's any stories that we share, it's really from our own experience. And so I think that standard is the same for men and women, aunties and uncles. I know when the first time that I ever saw anything that was really weird was I think it was like a distant uncle, but it was his son that he would like. Oh, see, it's like it's that thing that like I can't even talk about it, right? Because it's just weird. Because but like I remember, I mean, I would go to sleep at her house, and like he never did anything to me, but he would like wrestle his son down on the ground and then would like play with his son's like penis, like that's yeah, like, and his like, and I mean his son was probably like, I don't know, maybe like second grade or something, so I mean his son knew this was like weird, but he would do that, and I just remember feeling like this is weird, but it's that kind of thing that was just like, wow, like, like I wish, like I'm curious now, like if he remembers that and thinks back and feels a little bit traumatized by it, right? Because it's, I mean, totally like violating him, and just like the way that he probably grows up and views that. And so I again, that's another uncle story, so if there are auntie stories, please do share those, because I don't want anyone to feel like we are just specifically targeting like uncles, but those are just the stories, like the narratives that we're used to and have heard and seen. And so definitely speak up.
Yeah, I want to respond to that one too. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Wong, in the sense of like the aunties can be just as bad as uncles, right? And we're not saying that all uncles are perpetrators and that all aunties are perpetrators, right? I think it's important to realize that even when you're not somewhat, like, I think this is the biggest distinction that a lot of men need to grapple with too, is when we talk about men being perpetrators, it's because primarily men are the biggest perpetrators of sexual violence, right? That's just a fact. But that's not to say that all men are perpetrators of sexual violence. And just like you mentioned, Wong, that sometimes aunties can be just as bad as uncles. And that's because those of us that don't cause harm, so we're upholding a certain system or a certain practice or a certain cultural norm that allows those things to happen, right? So like Callie's example of mentioning that father playing with his child's penis, right? I think that's a very common practice in our home countries. Like I've heard that example many times in different API communities I've heard of. That's just the way they play, right? And oftentimes, right, the uncles and both aunties as well will say that that's normal. That's just what they do, right? So it's really up to all of us that really see that as a harmful act to intervene, to say something, right, to say that that's not normal. Because what that does for the child is it starts to socialize that child to realize they don't have any autonomy over their body, and especially over their sexual genitalia, right? So those are normalizing touches that we don't think about. That's very harmful, right? So while I'm completely agree with you that it's not just men, that it's a whole responsibility of all of us as a community to respond to those things.
Yeah.
So this next question is, I guess, pretty heavy. So we can try to unpack it a little bit, but what needs to change in our community in order for sexual violence victims to be able to speak out?
What needs to change? I think the biggest shift is that we need to recognize that as a community, we have to respond, right? So I think there's a lot of really beautiful cultural nuances and practices that we have a community. And one of the things I'll share is like COVID, right? I think through COVID, we saw a lot of mainstream societies start this idea of mutual aid. Let's start mutual aid for people that have COVID. How do we drop off food for elders in the house that don't have supplies, that don't have food, right? And so for me, being like an activist or someone that works in social justice and actually in the community, to me, when I heard that idea, it sounded so odd to me, because in our Hmong and our Vietnamese communities, those are things that we've always done, pandemic or not, right? So how do we continuously lean into those practices that are beautiful, that are impactful in our communities, and continue doing that? And one of those things is accountability, right? I think a lot of times we take on this responsibility of raising our kids, watching out for each other's kids, letting each other know when we see our kids in public, or the kids always say hi to the elders. Those are all good practice and protective factors. So I think we need to lean into those things, realize that a lot of the solutions already exist in our community, and support each other in holding, for just saying as an example, those bad uncles or those bad aunties responsible. Instead of making the whole community have to work around them, they have to work around the community, right, to cause harm, right? So imagine if all 5 of us, instead of saying that, hey, tell our kids to stay away from that uncle, all 5 of us tell that uncle to stay away from our kids, right? So that completely shifts that dynamic and the power away from them to be able to cause those types of harm.
Yeah, and like I kind of wish there was not so much shame for like victims, because I feel like that's a big part of it too, like, right? Like, because I have a daughter, and I can understand where you might, like you might not want people to know that something happened to your daughter, right? Because it's a community, but I kind of wish the response would not be like, oh, like now you're, like now you're, I don't know, like now you're not like clean anymore, right? Like, and I just wish, like that if we had something like that happen in our families, that, that we can like surround the victim and like support the victim and not make them feel even worse, or even, just like not damage, but, I feel like those are sometimes like connotations that comes with it that I feel like makes victims feel like more even like you're already feeling bad about all this stuff that happened. And now, you have all this other people's like, like the way that they might feel on your own shoulders of, like taking on a lot of that stuff. So
right. I think what you mentioned is spot on, Callie, in the sense that we need to shift the onus on the harm doer to take responsibility, right? Instead of the victim or the survivor having to take on the onus and all the shame, we need to shift that shame and that onus onto the harm doer so that they can change their ways and shift their responses to the community. But instead, oftentimes our communities, like you mentioned, they may say, that person's damaged, that person is no longer clean, putting a lot of the onus on somebody when it's a situation that they can't control. It's something that happened to them that they cannot control, they didn't do to themselves, and it's very traumatic at the same time. So a lot of that really starts to come down to putting the onus on the harm doer and supporting the survivors and actually believing them. Right? I think a lot of times it starts with believing. I think even a lot of people in our community won't disclose that they've experienced these things because there's a fear that they will not be believed. So,
yeah, I think those are great points, and goes a great segue into this next question of if you know someone who is a victim of sexual violence, say someone in your family, what should you do, right? Because there are oftentimes so much shame in our AAPI communities when we talk about these types of things, that sometimes you do kind of feel like, if it is someone do you speak up or do you not speak up? Like, what is the right thing to do? Sometimes you do feel like your hands are tied, that you can't say anything because if you do, relationships will get ruined. There's a lot on your shoulders as someone who may have seen it or know it. It's like, what do you do?
Yeah, I think all those things you mentioned are real, right? Those are all real pressures. I think the first thing I mentioned is disbelieving the survivor, right? So I think avoid asking questions of like, what were you doing when that happened to you, right? I feel like when someone discloses sexual violence, let them disclose on their own pace and the story as they experienced it, right? To say, what were you doing is almost like saying, why were you in that location, right? Or like simply asking questions. You may think it was harmless, but if you say, hey, were you drunk? Then you're saying that happened to you because you were drinking. But no one should experience sexual violence, even if they're drunk or not, right? Or you ask them, what time was it at, right? So those are questions that may seem very harmless, but to someone that's in a very traumatic situation, that's just experienced a life-changing event, those can sound very victim blaming, right? Like just because I was out at midnight, that doesn't mean I should experience sexual violence. It could happen at 3 in the afternoon. It could happen at 2 in the afternoon. It could happen any time in the day. So I think the first step is just believing them and just listening, right? I think oftentimes when we think about someone coming to us in a crisis situation, we want to ask questions. But we don't need to ask questions. I think we need to just listen, believe, hold space for that so that they can walk through it and understand it. And then the second thing is let them know that they didn't do anything wrong. There's no shame in what happened to you. It's not something that you could control, or it's all on the other person for causing harm. So I think the first step is believing it and avoiding asking questions that could be traumatizing or triggering or feel like they're taking the blame. So that's one thing I'll say. The second thing is I saw a question right here that's saying, what's the difference between domestic violence and sexual violence? So those are very different things, right? I think a lot of times people conflate them or mix them up. And it's important to understand that with domestic violence, oftentimes the services or things that you can render are very tangible. And what I mean by that is sometimes it's about getting them transportation, getting them their benefits, getting them shelter, getting them out of that situation, or taken to court to get a protective order, right? Those are all very tangible things. With sexual violence, you have to realize that somebody's being, their wholeness was taken away from them. So the goal of sexual violence is really healing. So when anyone shares that they've experienced sexual violence, we want to take the time to figure out what's going to make them feel whole again, right? And that's not going to be getting them a new house, because those things can still trigger them. It's not going to be getting them new benefits, right? It's really about thinking about what are things that bring them joy, what are the things that bring them to this idea of wholeness, and fostering those things, whether it's dance, whether it's cooking, whether it's eating together. So those are really the difference. The biggest difference between domestic violence and sexual violence is the way in which they can heal from it. Right?
So like if you're like outside of the situation, but still close enough to like, you know, care, right? Like, is there like, what could you do? You know, because I know somebody who this happened to, and it's like like it's, you know, and like the you know, like the perpetrator is like, just from my knowledge, just like walking around while the victim is, you know, probably dealing with lots of different things.
Yeah.
And it's like, as somebody like distant from that situation, I just feel like I want to do something, but I, you know, like I want to go on Facebook and blast this person, you know. But at the same time, it's like I'm distant enough where I feel like I want to respect like how they're doing what they need to do. But you know, do you guys ever talk about those kind of things, and how, you know, and especially it being the, you know, our community where there are so many things to think about, right? And so many just cultural traditions that has to happen.
Yeah, I think that is a great question in terms of, well, what can you do, right? And I think it's important to not ask what can we do, but how does that survivor want us to respond? I think oftentimes we forget, and we automatically in our mind, we think that perpetrator is walking around free, they should be in jail, or they should be arrested, right? But sometimes, like you said, there's so many cultural nuances that we're not considering. Maybe that survivor has a different idea of what justice is for them, and maybe they don't want that person that harmed them, because maybe that could be a family member, that could be someone they once loved. They don't want that person to be incarcerated, right? So the biggest thing that you can do is really ask them, what do they need, and what does justice and healing look like for them, right? So that's one thing we did at NAPIESV, is we actually hosted a roundtable with survivors all across the country and ask them, what does justice look like for you? What does healing look like for you, right? Because oftentimes, especially in the United States, we think about criminal justice as the only form of justice, but that's not always justice for people, right? That's sometimes very traumatic. It's very rare and very hard to actually prove sexual assault in court. So a lot of survivors don't want to go down that path. But justice for them can be that person apologizing. Justice can be that person actually going home and telling their mom or their dad what they did to that other person. Justice can be that person standing in front of the community and expressing their remorse for what they did and committing to not doing that again, right? Because those are things that are communal. Those are things that are culturally responsive in our communities, right? And just like you mentioned, Callie, you may just want to go blast that person on social media. And we've actually seen that happen. And sometimes survivors don't get the justice they want from the court system. So they've gone into publicly disclosing who the perpetrator was. And that's their own form of justice, right? So I think what you can do is ask them what they need and support because sometimes when you're in crisis, you don't have the spaciousness to think about your own needs because you're just trying to survive, right? So what does justice look like for you? What is it going to take for you to heal? What would make you feel better knowing even though this person's out? How can I make you feel safe if that person's in our same space? Those are little small steps that you can take that really give the autonomy and amplify exactly what the survivor needs versus what we imagine would be justice or survivorship for us, right?
Thank you for that. That's
I love those questions.
Yeah. I want to grab Chai's. So Chai said, at what age does sexual violence occur the most? I got daughters and like to keep an eye out or just be aware. And I like my daughter is 5, and this is the weirdest thing, but like I try not to be like even too affectionate with my daughter because I get scared like that she's gonna be used to that, you know what I mean? Like, and not in like a good way, but I just don't want her to feel like, oh, that's okay for people to be like tickling me, you know. And of course, my daughter, so I think she's super cute, but you know, I feel like I don't want to tickle her too much, or I don't want to like, because then I don't want her to feel like, oh, like every adult is gonna be like this, right? They're just gonna like hug me and hold me and kiss me and stuff like that. And so it's like this is such a good good question.
Good question.
Yeah, Chai, thank you so much for that question. So I don't want to necessarily focus on what age it happens the most. What I will share is some of the things I think are really good antidotes to think about over the life course of your child, what would really make them feel safe and actually as a protective factors from sexual violence, right? So I think, like Callie, you mentioned as your daughter, you don't want to be overly affectionate with your child because you're worried that they may think that's normal. But I would actually argue for you to actually keep your affection completely normal with your child, but teach them to try to have boundaries. Like, mommy can touch you like this, but if anybody else touches you like this, let mommy know. Or if you don't like me touching you like this, you let me know, even as your mom, right? And start to teach your daughters and your sons as well that they have boundaries. They have things that they can say no to and the power to feel uncomfortable, right? I think a lot of times we don't let children feel uncomfortable because we think that we're instilling respectfulness and politeness and manners in them, right? But sometimes it's important for us to teach them that they can have boundaries and they can put those boundaries up and they will be respected, right? So I think for young children, that's really important. The other thing is, I think as children start to age from 11 on, it's really important for us to let them know that, because I know this is a big thing. A lot of parents say you cannot date. They tell children that all the time. You cannot date. And so what ends up happening is they start dating either way, right? So that's one thing I want to tell all parents is whether you tell your child they cannot do it or not, they're going to do it. So the most important thing that we can do as caring adults and parents is keeping that line of communication open, is letting them know that, hey, I don't like you to date. I don't want you to date. But if you do date and something happens, I want you to know that you can come to me. Because I've seen this instance so many times where the parents are hardline, you cannot date until you're a certain age. And say they happen to date before that and they experience some kind of relationship violence or sexual violence, they're scared that they're going to get in trouble and they don't go to their parents. Then what that does is that further isolates them and then allows a perpetrator to cause more harm to them because they have nowhere to go because they're going to get in trouble either way, right? Mm-hmm. So as your children are in their teenage age and as they're reaching puberty, it's important for us to keep our lines of communication open. Let them know that they can come to us with anything and that they're not going to be in trouble for it, that they're actually going to be supported, they're going to be listened to. And those are the biggest protective factors that you can do, right? Because what you're doing there is you're explicitly modeling to them what a healthy relationship is, right? You're not modeling that only one person is in control. You're modeling that two people can be in control of a relationship. You're modeling open communication. You're modeling problem solving together. You're modeling a family resilience together. So those are some of the things that I've mentioned. If you want to keep an eye out to be aware, Chai, is actually talk to your children more. Let them know, build a great relationship to them that they can come to you at any time with any kind of issues that you have.
Yeah.
So
good. One last thing. I think this is really important to mention too. I'm so sorry. Around children too is we have to start talking to them and not normalizing abuse and violence, right? Because I think one of the biggest things we tell children, especially elementary school children, is if somebody likes you, they tease you. If somebody likes you, they're going to be mean to you, right? If somebody likes you, they're going to be jealous of you. And so what we're doing is we're normalizing very unhealthy behaviors for children to where they grow up and they think that abuse is love, right? So how do we model for our children that abuse isn't love, that actually kindness is love, consideration, thoughtfulness, gentleness, asking for permission is love, right? So model those things for our children instead of saying, hey, if that girl's mean to you at school, if that boy's teasing you, it's because they like you. Then they start to get mixed messages about what love is, right? So I wanted to mention that as well.
That's deep. That's really deep.
Yeah.
Okay. So speaking of permission, and you talked a little bit earlier when we asked about sexual violence is, what is sexual consent and what does it look like? Because we have lots of instances where people are confused. They think you're playing hard and get, or you are, sending mixed signals, or you really actually want it when you don't. So what exactly is sexual consent?
So there's going to be a couple of components to what is consent, right? And I want to caveat by saying that consent is not something that exists in our communities, right? Consent is a very U.S. centric thing. And it's like really the foundation of the cornerstone of sexual violence prevention work in the United States is consent or permission, right? And the way it's defined in the United States is that one, it's ongoing. That means that you're consenting to every stage of the interaction. The second thing is that it's clear and coherent. So you're not under the influence of drugs or alcohol. You're able to consent, right? Just think about if you're signing some kind of legal document, no lawyer will let you sign it if you're drunk or high on drugs, right? The other thing is that there's no coercion, right? So it can't be a dynamic where it's unequal power. So it can't be like a police officer forcing you to sign something because you're scared of them or authority, right? So those are the three components that I want to talk about consent. But specifically in our communities, I think when we think about consent, it's important to think about the cultural norms that exist for us as a community. Is it that in intimate partner relationships or in marriages that women think that it's their duty to have sex with their husband? Is that something that we need to unpack? Is that consensual? What about the idea of arranged marriages? Can there be consent in that situation? Right.
Mhm.
So for us, like I mentioned, the more that we can start to teach our kids that they have choice, they have autonomy, those are the ways in which we can build consent outside of sexuality, outside of sexual relationships, to where they can bring that in, right? So for us, when I talk about consent in our communities, no matter which community I go into, whether it's the Hmong community, the Vietnamese community, the Korean community, I always ask, have you guys ever learned about consent in your communities? And what does that look like? Has your mom ever told you have permission to say no? Has your dad ever told you have permission to say no, right? So thinking about consent in those ways can really help us redefine what consent is, right? Because I've asked young people, what is consent, or what is a lack of consent? And they've even mentioned to me, it's like an auntie and uncle force feeding you when you're not hungry, right? They just keep putting food on your plate, right? So those are those small nuances and practices in which consent comes out in our daily lives that we don't think about, but really have a lasting impact on the way in which we view consent.
Yeah, I do feel like with the consent things, it's kind of like I like how you talked about like in arranged marriages or just marriages in couple
Right.
or I think like I do kind of want to share a little bit too about the reason why Callie and I decided to have this topic because it wasn't really about like the sex part, but it's kind of like almost like harassed, like sexual being harassed by someone, right?
Right.
And this was really something that we hadn't thought about a topic for our show, but because of the experience that someone I know went through, and I was there to see it, I was there to protect her from it, and
Right.
I think it's just so crazy that some people just don't understand like no means no. When someone tells you to stop, it really means stop.
Yeah.
Whether that's in a marriage, a relationship, or when you're courting, or whatever it
Yeah.
may be, and I feel like because we don't talk about that in our community, it's I don't know if maybe it's just hard for some men to grasp onto
Yeah.
no,
Mhm.
or like even women too. I mean, I don't know. I feel like it's just hard when you talk about like consent,
Yeah.
because even if like you putting your hand on someone's leg, even if it's like again like not intentional, but if they say if it makes them feel uncomfortable, or if they move their leg and you see that they moved it, like why would you want to put your hands back onto their leg
Right.
if specifically like twitched or moved because they feel uncomfortable,
Mhm.
So I don't know. I feel like with the word consent, do we have to say no, or
Yeah.
can people tell by like our body language or our
Yeah.
facial expressions or
That
the
is,
words that we're choosing to say?
yeah, that's a great point, Olivia, because consent is not as simple as just a yes or no, right? I think people
Mm-hmm.
have to realize that when I meant that it's ongoing, that it's got to be they're comfortable in their body, their
Yeah.
language, right? Because even in our communities, right, in our API communities and a lot of our communities, we nod when someone's talking. That doesn't necessarily mean we're agreeing with them, but
Right.
some people may take that as consensual, right? And then talking about this idea of sexual harassment, I think the reason a lot of people have a hard time grasping this idea and understanding that no means no is because the way in which we frame relationships, right? So what do we call it when somebody's pursuing somebody else, like randomly at a club? What do you guys call that?
What do we call what?
Like if someone's pursuing somebody else in a club, like what if someone walks up to one of your friends and starts talking to them? What do we call that?
They're trying to hit on you? I don't know.
Exactly. They're trying to hit on you, right? Exactly,
Yeah.
right? And so I think we forget and don't pay attention enough of like how violent that word is. Why is it that if someone's pursuing you that they have to hit on you, right? Or even the language we use around sex is so violent, right? If we think about someone smashing that, hitting that, tearing that up. So all these very violent terms that we start to use around relationships that are all about domination or winning over somebody else, right? And that's when it starts to seep into relationships and it doesn't seem like it's balanced anymore. But that's because generally we start to socialize each other to understand that like dating is about winning or losing. You got to play the game, right? You have game or not as a guy, right? So there's so many things like that guys need to think about, or even people pursuing other people about what does it mean when you're pursuing somebody else, right? Is it really sexy to force yourself on somebody, or is it more sexy to be like, what do you like? What are your needs? How do I tend to your needs? How do I satisfy you instead of just looking to satisfy themselves, right? So there's so many aspects that lead into it, but ultimately I think it comes down to the fact that when we think about relationships, it's such an uneven pursuit, and so much about winning over somebody else that leads to these imbalances in power and these harmful situations.
Yeah. Great call on that. Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit to kind of talk about resources. And now you mentioned the organization you work for before, and I couldn't capture that. I don't know if you said like NAPSIV, but could you tell us a little bit about the organization you work for?
Sure. So I work for NAPIESV, which is the National Organization of Asian and Pacific Islanders Ending Sexual Violence. The one thing I want to mention is that we're not a direct service provider. That means we don't work with survivors directly. Our whole existence and our whole mission is support culturally specific organizations and community-based organizations all across the country and the Pacific Territories in enhancing their ability to work with survivors, right? So in terms of resources, if you're looking for resources for someone you know that may be experiencing sexual violence, I recommend either reaching out to me or going on our website. We have a directory of organizations that serve APIs that experience sexual violence. And those organizations are really have the expertise and understand a lot of the cultural nuances that we shared today to provide the most effective services, right? Because I think about mainstream organizations and service providers like rape crisis centers or things like that. They may not understand the cultural nuances that you've all shared, right? They may not understand that it's in your family. You don't want anybody to know. You don't necessarily want to pursue criminal charges, but you want a certain type of accountability. So the culturally specific organizations are the ones that can really support the cultural needs and reaffirm the needs of the survivor. And so there's a directory on our website. If you happen to not find anything in your area, reach out to me and I can definitely reach out to our national network and find an organization to support anybody that needs support.
Awesome. And I think you kind of covered the questions 8 and 9, so I'm not going to ask those, but I do want to, Wong Hong Solo has another, I thought, a really good question. For the last couple of months, my kids have been bringing me information about the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the educational system and political agendas? And probably more so also because I feel like that's how I learned about sex was through school. I have never talked about sex with my parents.
Right.
And so I think those are really valid just concerns and thoughts, especially I think as I definitely feel like our, like school systems are changing also, like, how early they talk about sex and then, the content of those conversations as well.
Right. Yeah. So my thoughts on the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, and then thoughts on like the education system and political agendas. I think it's important for us to really think critically about what's lacking in our schools and what's being added in, right? So I think initially a lot of people, when they think about why are you teaching my children about race, or why are you teaching my children about sex, or why are you teaching my children about homosexuality or gayness or lesbian or LGBTQ issues? And a lot of people automatically think that if you teach the children about that they're going to experience those things or they're going to go through those things, right? But the most important thing to realize is those are actually protective factors when they learn about it, right? All of us here are adults, and we can attest to the fact that when we had sexual education in schools, there was nothing about consent. There was nothing about healthy relationships. It was all about pregnancy prevention and scare tactics. All I remember was seeing a bunch of pictures of STDs and how to put a condom on a banana, right? So those are things that are insufficient in terms of providing our kids what they need to know about a healthy relationship, right? And in terms of infusing a political agenda, I really think we're really selling ourselves short if we're worried about it being a political thing, right? I think we need to think about ethnic studies or things like that as ideas for us to reaffirm our actual histories and things that API communities have experienced, especially right now in Asia Pacific Islander History Month, Heritage Month, is that a lot of the things we want to teach about are just the accuracy of what's happened to our people, right? Whether that's the Hmong migration patterns, the conflicts that happen in Southeast Asia, and why our people are actually here, right? It's important for our children to understand that, of like, even myself, I'm born in the United States, but I never learned about the Vietnam War or why I'm actually here, right? Except for from my family. Now, how reaffirming and supportive would that be if our schools actually taught those things and our children start to understand, hey, I'm here. I'm not a foreigner. I was here because our country decided to start a conflict in my parents' home country, and it forced me to migrate here, right? Because whether we accept it or not, we're going to be seen as foreigners in this country. Whether we speak perfect English, whether we're educated here, we're always going to have that perpetual question of where you're from. Now, how supportive and how much belonging would our children feel if they were taught their actual histories in schools, accurate histories in schools, things that affirm their identity instead of learning about things that they had never experienced, right? So I think for me, I think the educational system, the more it can infuse histories of different countries, because we're such a diverse country of so many different migrants, and we can touch on all those things, it'll actually lessen the fear that people have of each other, right? I think there's so much fear of people that we don't understand, people that we don't know, but the more we know about each other, the less conflict there'll be, right? And so when I think about the educational system, I don't really think it's anything about political agendas. I think there's nothing wrong with infusing our histories, infusing our knowledge, infusing our experiences, infusing our livelihoods into history so that more people understand it, right? Because if you interact with the general American public, there's not a lot of people that can really understand the conflicts that happen in Southeast Asia. There's not a lot of people that can talk about those things, right? So that's why they feel like perpetual foreigners, because they don't understand that, hey, the country had a hand in the fact that we migrated here, right? So I'm all about it. And short hold for Wang Han Solo is I'm all about it. I leave politics out of it. I think education in any sense is healthy, right? Political discourse in a healthy manner is always good as well. So thanks for asking that question.
Yeah, and I definitely feel like, you know, like with as my children get older, I just feel like I need to be like even a stronger supplement to what they're learning,
Right.
you know, because I felt like when I was in school, like, of course, my parents didn't speak English, didn't know much. And so they rely on the school heavily to teach me.
Yeah.
That's what I learned, right? Everything at school.
Yeah.
And now it's kind of like, you know, even when we talk about sex, where, you know, I do want to be the first person that talks to my kids about sex, right? Because then I get to control what that is like versus them hearing things outside for the first time. So I definitely feel like as parent, being like more, you know, intentional about how we talk with our kids about not just about sex, but like everything else, you know, like being the first person to talk to them so that they can, you know, feel more comfortable with asking questions.
Right.
All right. So for those who are looking to connect with you, what are some of the best ways to get a hold of you?
I'm not a big social media person, so that's not going to happen. So there's no social media for me. But if you want to contact me, feel free to email me. I don't know if you guys can add that email if people want to reach out for resources or further conversations. But I'll share my email with Olivia and Kali. Yeah, that's the best way to reach me is just through my work email.
Perfect. Yeah, we will make that available in case those who are wanting to chat with you or wanting to unpack or have some questions.
Sure.
That way they can kind of reach out to you via email.
Absolutely happy to do that.
Is there any just last thoughts that you want to leave with our audience? Any
last minute thoughts? Sure. Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that we're seeing right now is like this Asian hate, right? This anti-Asian hate, right? So I think for us, the most important thing is for always to think about the next generation. And I hate when people say like youth are the future. The truth is the youth are now, right? So if all of us here in this room are caring adults and we care about the next generation, or we care about the kids in our lives, or we care about the people in our lives, it's important for us to think about in which ways can we foster belonging in our communities and having our communities belong, right? And so that question that Wong brought up to me made me think so much about this divide that we're experiencing in the United States, this polarization of talking about so many different things. And I think we are losing this ability to have a positive discourse with each other, right? So I think Kali and Olivia holding this platform and this space is really critical for our communities to understand that we need to talk about a lot of things and talk about it in productive ways, right? We can no longer be living in these silos where we think that side doesn't believe what we have to say, and we only talk to people that share the same perspective, right? But the challenge is we have to be productive in it. We can't just go in looking for conflict, right? So that's the first thing if we want belonging. The second thing I want to mention is this anti-Asian hate and this lack of belonging that our young people experience are very real, right? So suicide is the leading cause of young Asian Americans, if you all didn't know out there. So to think about that when we think about worrying about what's in the educational system, how do we educate to where our children feel like they belong more? How do we talk about healthy relationships so they're not facing abuse or traumatic events in their lives, right? And being caring adults, like I said, is about keeping open communication and giving young people the autonomy to share their thoughts with you, right? Because especially American-born children, they have so much access to information. They can do their own research. So for us, we have to honestly accept that as the age of information is around and talk to them, right? Don't tell them that, hey, you don't know anything. and those things like that. So I think support them, find ways to foster their belonging, whether that's through cultural education, being present, like Callie mentioned. I think those are some of the most important things we can do in terms of working to end sexual violence. So I wanted to add that.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that, especially when I think, like, I think just now am I like unpacking a lot of like generational trauma and stuff that, like childhood traumas and things like that. And I forget that I'm an adult now, and there's all these, I have like nieces and nephews that are younger who are also going through things. And I just loved what you said about, helping them to find a place and belonging in that, as I'm trying to sort the way that I belong in my communities, that they're also navigating that as well. So thank you for that.
Of course.
And so just a quick summary, we talked about sexual violence. We talked about cultural pieces to it. I know that, these are such heavy and just like really could dive a lot deeper into. Unfortunately, we had to just cover what we could during the hour, but we really hope that you were able to take some things away and just, like I always feel like the most important thing is for people to get comfortable with these topics and to think about them, and then to find other people who might be open to talking about it and making sense of these things, right? Because we never talked about these things before. And so like even as Nam is talking about these things, I'm like, wow, like that's definitely something that I want to take away and really ponder on and process and process them with my friends and my community. And so thank you so much, Nam, for being with us tonight and educating us. I definitely learned a lot. And so, of course, here at All That Talk, we believe that conversations drive change, and change starts with you. We will see y'all next week. Bye.
Thank you so much.